Hey folks, Harsha here from the team at e-GMAT. I'm back with a super exciting question for you. Now, feel free to pause the video, solve the question, and then once you've solved it, then resume the video. Alright, so with the assumption that you've solved the question, let's get right into discussing this. This is a question from OG Verbal Review 2020, and if you ask me whether this is a difficult question, I'm gonna say no. In fact, this is categorized as a medium level question. Does that make it easy? Absolutely not. The question has its own set of trick points, and if you're not careful, it's very easy to falter. So that's something you can see with the stats. It's not that 90% of students get this question right. No. Only somewhere between 55 to 60% of students typically get this question correct. So the correct answer is option E. Option D is an extremely tricky incorrect answer choice, and we're going to see why it's not the correct answer. What we're going to do in this video is a kind of a dissection of the question. So by the time you're done with this video, you'll have absolute clarity on the argument itself, why option E is right and why option D is wrong. So before we get into that, let me quickly run you through what are some of those interesting aspects about this question. Firstly, this is a slightly text heavy argument. It's not one of the shorter arguments out there. So if you're one of those people who kind of gets flustered when you see long arguments, make sure that you notice how we actually crack such arguments. We're going to go sentence by sentence, and within sentences we're going to break it down, and we make sure that we extract all the information that's necessary. Alright, so the second aspect of interest here is the conclusion. This is a question where if you do not visualize the conclusion well, you're going to understand it in a different way, and that understanding is going to impact your analysis of option E. So a lot of you who rejected option E, it's probably because you did not visualize the conclusion well. We're going to see that in this video. And finally, there is a reason why option D is so popular. There's a very subtle meaning trap at play here. We're going to discuss that also in depth in this video. Alright, so enough talk. Now let's get into analysis. So it's a long argument. We're going to break it down very slowly. Alright, so Ythex has developed a small diesel engine, okay, that produces 30% less particulate pollution, okay, than the engine made by its main rival once, alright, now widely used in Marania. So there's a lot of data there to unpack. Let's go slow. So essentially you have Ythex and you have once. We are given that Ythex has developed a small diesel engine, alright, that's cool. This particular engine produces 30% less particulate pollution than the once engine. So let's say the once engine causes particulate pollution of, let's say, 100 units, okay. That means the Ythex engine should produce 70 units of pollution. It's 30% less. So far so good. So this is one data point that we extracted. What else do we know? We also know that once is currently the main rival of Ythex. Okay, that's another point. It's just mentioned, you need to pay attention. And another important aspect, once is currently widely used in Marania. So if you ask the question which is the most popular engine in Marania right now, it's probably once, because it's the one that's most widely used. Alright, so that's another data point to unpack. So if this is clear, let's move to the next sentence. Ythex's engine is well suited for use in the thriving warehousing businesses in Marania. Alright, let's pause here. Essentially it tells us that, hey, this particular engine, this particular small diesel engine that Ythex has, it's very well suited for use in the warehousing businesses in Marania. What this is trying to suggest to us is that, hey, there is a demand for an engine like Ythex. There are these thriving, or in other words, flourishing warehousing businesses in Marania, and these businesses would love to have an engine that's like Ythex because it's very well suited for its use. Okay, so that's one piece of data here. Although is a contrast keyword, so you know that you're going to see something not so great about Ythex. Although it costs more than the once engine. So in terms of cost, so on one hand, Ythex's engines are perfectly suited for the kind of businesses you have in Marania. On the flip side, they are costlier. They are much more costly compared to the once engine that's given to us. All good. Now let's move on. The Maranian government plans to ban within the next 2 years, okay, the use of diesel engines with more than 80% of current diesel engine particulate emissions in Marania, and once will probably not be able to retool engines to produce emissions to reach this target. So very long sentence, but very important to understand. So essentially what this tells us is, hey, the Maranian government right now, of course, once is the most widely used, so obviously it does meet the current criteria of, you know, emissions or particulate pollution, but the Maranian government plans to ban within the next 2 years all engines which cause a pollution of more than 80% of the current emissions, and we are being told that ones will not be able to retool its engine. The inference here is that once the current one's engine will not be able to meet the new criteria. So let's kind of use an example to understand that. So let us say the current diesel particulate emission is 110. So this could be anything that's 100 or this could be anything that's greater than equal to 100, because even 100 Marania, even 100 the one's engine is allowed in Marania, it's widely used. So let's take a value that's 110 for example. So let's say the current diesel engine particulate emissions in Marania is 110. What we're being told is 80% of this 110, 80% of current particulate emissions, that is 88. What's going to happen is any engine that creates a pollution that is more than 80%, that is more than 88, any engine that creates a pollution of more than 88 units, it's going to get banned, and anything that is not more than 88, or in other words less than equal to 88, it's going to be allowed to operate in Marania. What does this mean for these two engines? In other words, the Ythex engine has a pollution parameter of 70, which is less than 88. So the Ythex engine will be allowed to operate. And the one's engine, as it stands now, it causes a pollution of 100 units, which is greater than 88. The one's engine will not be allowed to operate. That's what you should take away from this sentence. And we are also given that one's will probably not be able to retool its engine to reduce emissions so as to reach this target. Or in other words, the one's engine is currently stuck at 100. They are not going to be able to retool its engine to make sure that this comes below 88. Or in other words, it's pretty much guaranteed that the one's engine is going to get banned. That is the core implication of the sentence. Alright. So it is based on this that the author is now drawing a conclusion. If the ban is passed, the Ythex engine ought to sell well in Marania after that time. So what does this mean? Firstly, you have to notice that this is a hypothetical situation. We are not being told whether the ban is actually passed or not. In the situation that the ban is passed, then the Ythex engine ought to sell well or is expected to sell well in Marania after that time. So this of course is the main conclusion. So there you have it. It's all about making sure that you go slow and unpack each and every aspect of each and every sentence. If this is clear, let's move into pre-thinking. The first step for pre-thinking is what I call as a precursor step. That is, you make sure that you specifically visualize the conclusion and the logic before you do any kind of pre-thinking. Okay, so let's do that. Let's first visualize the conclusion. The conclusion, as we discussed, is hey, if this ban is passed, then the Ythex engine ought to sell well in Marania after that time. There are two aspects that I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, if the ban is passed, as we discussed, means that this is a conditional conclusion. It's a hypothetical conclusion. We don't know if the ban is actually going to be passed. We have no idea. But the conclusion is, if in the case that the ban is passed, if that ban is actually passed, then the Ythex engine ought to sell well in Marania after that time. So it's important to notice these things. So that's one aspect that you need to understand. The second aspect of interest is what I have bolded here. When you say ought to sell well, that means that the author expects the Ythex engine to sell well. This is not the same as saying that the Ythex engine will sell well. So there is a difference between saying that the Ythex engine will sell well and saying that the Ythex engine is expected to sell well. So make sure that you understand that these are not the same. The Ythex engine may be expected to sell well, but in reality it may not sell well. It may not be expected to sell well, but in reality it could sell well. So this is just expectation, whereas this is about what actually happens. There is a difference. You need to be cognizant of this. Now, so essentially the author says that, hey, if this ban goes through, the Ythex engine, it's expected to sell well. You can expect it to sell well. Now, what is the logic for this? If you really think about it, the core logic is about the competition getting cut. What do we know? Once the ban is passed, if this ban gets passed, we already discussed this. If the ban gets passed, 88 is the new cutoff. What that means is anything greater than 88 is going to get cut. So one's engine, which is at 100, is going to get banned, and the other engine, that is Ythex, which is at 70, it's not going to get banned. It's going to be allowed. So essentially, once the ban goes through, one's is going to get banned. Ythex is not going to be banned. We are given that Ythex is perfectly well suited for the businesses here, and therefore, given that the current engine that is widely used, that is the one's engine, the current dominant player in Maranian market, that is one's, given that one's is going to get banned, given this lack of a strong competition, the author expects that Ythex will sell well. So this is the core logic that is at play here. Now, if this is clear, now let us go into pre-thinking. Okay, so let's frame the falsification question. In what scenario can we not expect that the Ythex engine will sell well, even if this ban actually gets passed? Okay, so when you think about the situation, you have to think about the logical gaps. The author's core logic is based on the fact that, hey, currently once is the major player, but once this ban is implemented, once is going to be banned. On the other hand, Ythex is going to have a field day because it meets the criteria and it is well suited. What has the author not told us anything about? What about other competitors? What about other players? What if there is some other company A which comes up with a engine that is equally good and equally popular? What if such a situation happens? In such a situation, given that unlike the author's expectation, it's not that you ran out of competition, you still have supremely strong competition for the Ythex engine. Can you still realistically expect that this engine will sell well? Absolutely not. So if there is a competitor, some other competitor who comes up with an equally good in terms of performance engine, and it's also equally popular as compared to Ythex, or it could be more popular and better also. If there is somebody who is at least as good and at least as popular as Ythex coming into this market, then you cannot still expect that Ythex will do well. Why? Because your entire logic of why Ythex will do well was based on the fact that the current main player, that is once, is going to go out. Or in other words, the aspect here was the lack of competition. So if indeed there is strong competition, you cannot expect this to happen. So this is one falsification condition. Another condition where your conclusion breaks is also very, very simple. What if, in fact, there is always a gap between passing a bill and actually implementing it, passing something and actually implementing it. Even if the ban is passed, it has to be implemented properly, right? What if the ban, in a place like Marania, a ban cannot be implemented properly? And when I say properly, I mean to the right degree. To the point that 1Z engines are either not sold at all or sold at significantly low numbers. What if a ban at such a proper level is not at all possible in a place like Marania? Then just the fact that the ban is passed, can you still expect that the Ythex engine will not sell well? That the Ythex engine will sell well? No. Yet again, your conclusion will break down in such a situation. So there you have it. You have two conditions and therefore two assumptions. The first assumption that there is no other competitor who is going to come up with an engine that's at least as good and at least as popular as the Ythex engine. That's one assumption. Another assumption is, in this place called Marania, this ban, once it gets passed, the ban can actually be implemented to the required needed level, to a proper level. And when I say to a proper level, we mean that to such a high level that 1Z engines are either not at all sold in this place, completely banned, or sold at significantly low numbers, not good enough to impact the expected good sales of Ythex. Okay, so these are two assumptions that we can come up with. If this is clear, now let's get into option choice analysis. Now, option choice analysis here is actually fairly straightforward, especially with regards to options A, B, and C. So let's run through them. Option A says Marania's warehousing and transshipment business buys more diesel engines of any size than any other types of businesses. Essentially, option A is simply suggesting to us that, hey, more diesel engines of any size will be bought, are being bought by Marania. Or in other words, it tells us that there is going to be a demand for small engines, small diesel engines as well. If Marania's businesses buy more diesel engines of any size, that means that they also buy small diesel engines, which means that there is definitely demand for Ythex engines that are like Ythex. But that is a problem. It stops there. It only tells us that there is a demand for engines like Ythex, which honestly we already know from the argument. The argument tells us this much already. The problem is it does not tell us anything specific to Ythex. The conclusion is about whether or not Ythex is going to sell well. Just the fact that demand exists for any small engine similar to Ythex does not tell us anything about whether Ythex itself will sell well or not. So option A therefore is absolutely not an assumption. So let's go to option B. Ythex is likely to be able to reduce the cost of its small diesel engine within the next 2 years. Now, it's again a very interesting option, but again, you have to understand how the author has written the argument. The author has already incorporated the fact that the Ythex engine is more costly than the current popular engine, that is the 1Z engine. We are given that Ythex is costlier than 1Z, and we are given that 1Z is the one that's currently widely used. So given the current cost, the author still expects that it will sell well. So we need to find an assumption for why it is expected to sell well, given that it's already costlier. So the fact that it's going to reduce its cost does not have any impact on this particular conclusion. So cost is frankly immaterial in this argument, which makes option B incorrect. Now let's come to option C. The Iranian government is generally favorable to anti-pollution regulations. This essentially increases a belief that the government will actually go through and pass the ban. If it's favorable towards anti-pollution regulations, the expectation is this ban will be implemented. But remember, the argument does not care about whether the ban actually gets implemented or not, or whether the ban actually gets passed or not. The conclusion is hypothetical. Whether or not the ban actually gets passed or not, nobody cares. In reality, what happens if the ban gets passed? If the ban gets passed, what is going to happen? That is what the conclusion is all about. So option C therefore is completely irrelevant. Remember that your conclusion is about a hypothetical situation. What happens if the ban gets passed? Whether the ban gets passed or not, nobody cares. So now let's come to option D, which is by far the most popular option choice for most popular incorrect option choice. So the problem with option D, and this is where some of you might definitely falter, is you do not understand the meaning of difficult to enforce. So option D says the government's ban on high levels of pollution caused by diesel engines, if passed, will not be difficult to enforce. Or in other words, this ban will not be difficult to enforce. Here's the problem. Difficult to enforce does not mean that it cannot be enforced properly, or it cannot be enforced to the needed degree. Absolutely not. Even if something is very, very difficult to impose or enforce, it can still be enforced with 100% efficiency. In other words, the people who have to enforce this ban, they might have to go through hell to make sure that it is enforced, but they can still enforce it to 100% levels. It may be the case that not even one's engine gets sold in Marania post the ban. 100% proper implementation is possible even if it is difficult to enforce. So the problem here is, if you assume that difficult to enforce means that it cannot be enforced properly, then you would be faltering. So what happens is, if you negate option D, it says that the government's ban will be difficult to enforce. The question you have to ask is, so what? Even if it is difficult to enforce, the people who have to enforce it may still be able to enforce it with 100% efficiency. Not even a single one's engine may be sold. The conclusion can still hold true. Or in other words, option D will fail the negation test, which makes option D the incorrect option choice, which leaves us with the correct answer, which is option E. So option E says the other manufacturers of small diesel engines, if there are any, have not produced an engine as popular and as clean running as Ythex's engine. So this is actually in line with our pre-thinking. Pre-thinking talked about the situation where, hey, what if there is some other competitor who produces an engine that is as good and as popular, so as clean running and as popular. So let's do a small deep dive into option E, because for some of you who did not choose option E, I can show you where you faltered. So let's talk about two situations. I told you about the distinction in the conclusion. If you visualize the conclusion incorrectly, you might face trouble in this particular question, in this particular option. So the incorrect conclusion would be, if the ban is passed, the Ythex engine will sell well. If you assume that this was the actual conclusion, and if you applied the negation test for option E here, then let me show you where the problem is. So let's assume that this is the conclusion. If the ban is passed, the Ythex engine will sell well in Marania. Okay. Now, what does negated option E say? Negated option E says there is some other competitor. Let's say ABC. ABC is some other competitor. There could be more. I'm just giving an example. That is as good as the Ythex. That's as clean running or efficient in operations as Ythex, and as popular as Ythex. So essentially, there is very strong competition for Ythex. Some player who's as good, whose engine is as good, and whose brand value is as strong. Okay. If this is the case, even if there is very strong competition to Ythex in the Maranian market, even then, the Ythex engine could still sell well. Despite the presence of strong competition, your Ythex engine could still sell perfectly well in Marania. Okay, what that means is, even in the presence of your negated option E, your conclusion can still hold true, which essentially means that option E will fail the negation test. This is what will happen if you take the conclusion this way, but this is not the correct conclusion. If you properly visualize the conclusion, this is the correct conclusion. The correct conclusion is not that the Ythex engine will sell well, it is that if the ban is passed, the Ythex engine ought to sell well, or in other words, is expected to sell well. And remember, what was the underlying logic of the author? Why does the author believe that this particular engine is expected to sell well? The author expects the Ythex engine to sell well because once the ban is implemented, or rather if the ban is implemented, then the current dominant player, the current widely used engine in Marania, that is once, will get banned. And then you have Ythex, which is not only suited to the businesses, it also meets the criteria. So the logic of the argument, the logic of the author is based on the fact that the main competition is getting cut out. Now, what happens in negated option E? Negated option E means that the main competition does not get cut out. There is some new competition that's coming in. Even if 1Z is not a factor anymore, even if the 1Z engine is not going to be around, there is some other player in the market whose engine is as good and whose brand game is as strong, who's as popular as Ythex. In such a situation, can the author still realistically expect that the Ythex engine will sell well? No. In other words, in this situation, your conclusion breaks down in the presence of the negated option E. So option E actually passes the negation test if you visualize the conclusion well. Option E will fail the negation test if you do not visualize the conclusion well. So there you have it. This is the importance of visualizing the conclusion. So that's about it. So let's kind of summarize the learnings from this particular question. Firstly, this is a slightly text heavy question, so make sure that you don't get bogged down by the size of the question. Each and every question is solvable. You just need to break it down and go systematically and slowly. Okay. The second aspect to remember is the difference between something being difficult to enforce and something being impossible to enforce properly. Even if something is extremely difficult to do, you could still do it. It may be very, very difficult to get 100 in your mathematics exam, but you may still get it. So just because something is difficult to enforce, don't assume that it's not possible to enforce properly. Okay. So that's very important. That's a very important learning from this question. Think about the unstated logical gap. Think about what did the author not tell you about. The author only told you about Ythex and once, and he told you that once is the main person, is the dominant player at this point. Then the author said that once will get banned. What the author didn't tell you is, what about other competitors? What if somebody else could fill that gap? Think about those unstated logical gaps. Assumption questions will become very, very easy for you. And finally, visualize the conclusion well. If you did not visualize the conclusion correctly, you would have rejected option E, which is in fact the correct answer. So there you have it. I hope this video was helpful for you. For any of you interested in a more detailed look at this question, check out our blog article on this question. You can find it in the description of this in this particular video. If you like what you saw, do click like on YouTube. And if you want us to do more content of this sort, do consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. And with that, as I always say, happy learning.